Joining the meeting. Joining the meeting.
Wade Schwab, Big Lakes runs.
Okay, it's a little bit after 1 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. Let's just start if we can get a roll of the people on the phone for attendance and quorum purposes.
Joey Schwab.
Okay.
We have Dr. Myers and Dr. Borton so far.
Ron Hansen.
Anybody else? Greg is on the phone.
There was a Wade too.
Yeah, Wade's on the phone. Okay. All right. So thanks for calling. Do we have a quorum? I don't know if that's enough.
Could be.
For the different reasons. Jeff? Oh, Jeff's on the phone. Okay. So we got a quorum. We'll get going with today's agenda.
Joining the meeting. Sarah Connolly.
Okay. Let's see. So minutes from last month have been distributed. Let's take a quick look at those. We will.
Dr. Brian,
Yes, sir.
for motion 17-26, I know what it means, but we may just want to insert a word or two to clarify that this is annual skills requirements. Because 5 years from now, we may not remember what that meant. So it's talking about removing pediatric intubation, EMT level, stuff like that. And so just maybe to write the following changes for annual skills or something like that. Just for posterity.
Yeah.
Were the meeting minutes distributed by email? Because I'm looking through the two that came this week and I'm not seeing the meeting minutes.
They were not. They're distributed here, unfortunately.
Okay, I'll abstain from voting on the minutes then.
Roger. All right, so anybody want to make a motion to approve the minutes as amended by Dr. Clemency, where motion 1726 says something along the lines of motion to remove pediatric intubation from the AEMT and CC levels for annual skills. All right, is there a second? Dr. Reed? Okay. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? And we have one abstention. Okay. Let's see. So we had a CMAC meeting since our last one. Since our last REMAC meeting, rather. I don't know that Dr. Bart or Dr. Walters is available. Dr. Walters is in Oriskany, and I don't know if Dr. Bart was planning to call in, but he's not here yet. So if he calls in, we'll see if there's a report.
Ron, did you go to the meeting?
I was part of the CMAC meeting?
Yes.
Yes, I did.
Can you give us your take on it?
I don't think there was any motions or anything coming forward. They reviewed some protocol changes to the state BLS protocols, but they're being forwarded to the EMSC folks and to the staff for comment. Once they come back, it could be voted on at the next meeting.
They also discussed that they had put a recommendation in to move the level age down to 17.
For basic EMT.
For basic EMT, and that unfortunately has to go through a regulatory process. She said literally the only thing they changed was the age, but they said it'd probably be a 6-month process before we get the clear for that.
How do they operation? So like CFR is 16 right now, right? How do they operationalize that with like parents' permission and things like that? Or do they not?
They still have to follow the state law for any like working conditions, so they can't work past a certain time or anything like that.
Do they need their parents' permission to get certified though?
I don't think there's nothing on the form. So
Can they sign it though if they're under age 18? Like,
It's a good question, we'll have to,
People
I
go
don't
through
know the
state
answer.
fire
I don't-
training at 16.
I'm sorry?
People go through state
State fire at
training
16?
Without their parents' permission?
I don't think there's a permission form. I don't remember signing one for that.
Yeah, we have not discussed it at any of our calls, so I don't know, we just said it was moving down and that was it, so.
Well, ideally, I'd like to see it offered as an elective in the senior
I think
year, and
that's the
then
goal
I think
of
we
a lot
can
of
get
the
parent
programs.
involvement.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Both
I'm just
through
curious.
BOCES and.
Yeah, we've got some schools
that's a good
in,
point, I'll write it down.
in Hamburg that does it, and one of their challenges is the kids who don't turn 18
right,
before they graduate. And
Right,
then,
absolutely, you have to have a test,
right,
test date.
that's also adversely affected some of their passing scores, just because if you're gone to college and you're coming back to take your test or whatever,
well, if we do it
you're
at
less
17,
engaged.
they'll have that senior year to actually volunteer or do work.
Well, I think that's great.
You know, a lot of the questions regarding, you know, the age and can they sign people off and things like that came up, you know, when we had CFRs at 16. So I'm sure that'll be addressed at some level. But again, the whole point was to try to spark some interest, get these folks involved in some EMS, and then at least do this in high schools, BOCES, other vocational areas and things like that. There was only one vote against it. Everybody else was in favor of it to pursue the regulatory change for 800.6.
Cool.
As for a chairman's report, I really don't have a whole lot that's not covered elsewhere in the agenda, but I'm going to send an email out to the program agencies and the regional council chairs to try to actually nail down a date
Joining the
for
meeting. Sylvette Heuscher.
the REMAC leadership retreat. We are working on an agenda for that. We have a couple things that I think will get the discussion started. So once we have a date, I will share that with everybody that needs to know and try to coordinate a meeting sooner than later. And then there's one thing that's covered a little bit later, but in between, since the last meeting, I received a request to give endorsement to Wellsville volunteer fire to reinstate themselves to paramedic level after being dropped down because of a controlled substance license issue. We didn't have a lot of precedent on that, but I did speak with their medical director who endorsed it, and I gave a provisional approval, so that way New York State would process that CS license for them, and they're going to come up later on when we talk about level of care changes. And that's all I've got, so we'll move on then to RTAC. Deb?
The RTAC is scheduled to meet on December 6th. Invitations have been sent out. RTAC Communications Subcommittee is scheduled to meet November 29th to review and discuss the data that was obtained in our Survey Monkeys. We had 7 hospitals reply to the hospital survey, and 513 providers answer the EMS survey. Stop the Bleed program requests are continuing to grow. We have done about 30 classes. Make that 32 because I did one last night and one this morning. Majority have been for private groups, so we still need a lot of public courses to occur. I've got at least 80 people trained as instructors, but a small handful of those people are actually teaching. There's a standard 1-to-8 instructor ratio, so it takes a few people to run a bigger class. We're looking for any help from anybody that can help out with this. I've got a request in Dunkirk to train 60 people at a plant. I can't do it by myself. Classes are an hour long. So that's it.
Thanks.
Can I also add that I did reach out to the RTAC chairwoman, is that correct? About seeing if REMAC could actually have an agenda line item on their meeting, and she did not see that as an issue.
Great. Okay. I didn't hear if Bruce was on the call, but
Just
Bruce.
pulled in the parking lot.
Oh, okay. Well, then we'll just come back to him in a moment. We'll go to program agency reports then. Lake Lane?
Good afternoon. We've had a few classes since we last met, and I do have a few classes coming up. If anybody's interested, I do have some flyers here with me. One that's actually not on here is I do actually have an ITLS class coming up. I know sometimes it's a hot class that people usually need because it's not offered very often. So if anybody's looking for an ITLS class, the information's on Lake Plains website. or they can give me a call. I can direct them to where they need to go. I have 2 NOIs for pads, American Legion in Wheatfield and the Village of Bergen have submitted those to me. I've had no usages or any other approvals at this time. Rapids did submit a BLS 12 lead usage report to me. It's probably the first one I've gotten in my region. So we are still continuing to advocate updating the website and signing up for emails for passing along information. So if anybody's interested, please go to lakeplainsems.org and sign up for those. Been pushing out the Narcan utilization forms so that we can grab that statistical data so we can send it up to the state. I've been working with the Collaborative Protocol Committee to help revise and work on hopefully revising the AEMT protocols and maybe putting some stuff back in for that particular level. So we will be hosting a CIC course sometime in January, just working out the details. As soon as that comes out, I will get the information out to everybody. So if anybody knows anyone looking to become a CIC, just have them keep an eye on the website or sign up for emails, and that information will go out.
Get off the ground?
I'm sorry?
When are you thinking that's getting that off the ground?
Sometime in January, probably mid-January. And then I do have some upcoming meetings. My Big Lakes meeting is this evening in Medina. Niagara, Orleans, and Genesee counties meetings are all next month. I do have the information if anyone's interested. That's all I have.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Stems.
I've attended the normal meetings, the regional meeting, and the 3 county meetings. We have some late PCRs in Cattaraugus and Chautauqua County. We have a lot of agencies that have gone live on ePCR or they're implementing. We had the EMS Leadership Academy on September 29th and 30th. We had 28 people come and attend its first training in our new building. I attended the Houghton Volunteer Fire Department open house. We had a stroke education CME that was held with the help of Olean General Hospital and Stryker. We had a carbon monoxide poisoning CME at the hyperbaric chamber at Olean General Hospital. And upcoming, well, today we had a Stop the Bleed with Beth and Mickey this morning, and we have 2 more tonight. And we're hoping to have an open house at our new building. We have an AEMT class that's going to be starting in January. Rob can answer anyone's questions about it. If they have any questions, and they can email me if they want more information. And then for REMAC, we've been working on updating the website and the policies to make sure it's all up to date. And we've also been working on making a membership list that includes all current emails and whatnot.
Mike,
Yes, sir.
can we, you mentioned hyperbarics and Olean, can we send people there for carbon monoxide poisoning?
They're not,
they're really doing
they're
it for
coffins, they're.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you have to
but
be
you-
licensed separately for that.
No, they can't
That's
accept
wound
them.
only.
They-
I didn't believe so.
So,
It's a conversation to have with Dr. Young, because
Okay.
he's got a different opinion than what they will say here.
Okay.
So,
We'll explore offline.
yes, that's a great idea.
Very good. But for now, we'll not refer people just there. Okay. UVMD.
We've held 3 preceptor training courses since the last REMAC meeting. 1 in Twin City, 1 in Wyoming County, and 1 in Buffalo Fire. We've been working with Catholic Health Systems, in particular with Dr. Jen Brown out of St. Joe's. We've had a couple of meetings with her, and we're trying to get the physician involvement from CHS more involved with the REMAC. And there are some logistics. One of the things is they actually have their site directors meeting is at exactly the same time every month as the REMAC meeting. And so that would probably explain why Dr. Ellman and some of the other docs who are normally would be attending, they haven't been able to do that. So they have some internal stuff that they have to take care of, but they recognize the need for their increased participation here in the presence, and and the role that they have. So they are working to fix their internal things to increase participation. Likewise, with that, we are working specifically with the town of Cheektowaga. We're going to be offering, there's going to be a medical director meeting between Dr. Jen Brown and her services in Cheektowaga, just to try to improve some of the communication and the integration that goes on with those particular companies. It's no secret, you see them in the reports. Often the people on the bad list are from Cheektowaga and some other areas too, but we need to bridge some barriers and try to improve some of the communication that we have going on there. So there's an effort to do that. So I consider that to be a very positive thing, and they are sincerely interested in trying to improve some of that stuff too. The Bureau has revised the EPCR application, so if there's any services that are going for EPCR, the new 5136 is out. And then probably, other than the other stuff that's already included in the report that I want to highlight, we still have 4 services that didn't submit their credentialing reports. Two of them, we don't believe, from the conversations that we've had, we don't believe they have any EMS providers in their BLSFR services, so there's really nothing for them to report. One of them was actually going to draft a letter asking for their state code to be deactivated because they didn't have any providers. The other one, we're still a little unclear if they really actually have any providers or not. It's tough to get some straight answers out here. The other one is Buffalo Fire Department. They've made tremendous strides to getting their providers into the portal, but there are admittedly some other issues with skills that actually were not performed and as a part of the credentialing. And the last one is East Amherst Fire Department, and they are a paramedic level transport service. So at the pleasure of the REMAC, we're at the point of taking the next steps. We sent the certified letters. They gave them until October 24th to respond. These are the 4 outstanding that we have.
Have we heard anything from East Amherst?
We've actually had several conversations with them, and I'll look at the portal right now just to kind of see where they are. I meant to do this before, but we've had several conversations, but they frankly haven't submitted anything.
And none of those conversations talk about why?
Well, they did, so at the last meeting, they had a number of issues that they had to get resolved internally in terms of getting skills entered, and it didn't sound like it was an issue of them not being completed. It seemed more like an issue of, they just weren't getting people registered, and, so it, sorry, I can't multitask anymore.
That's okay.
Yeah, they still have about 8 people who are offline, nothing entered. Looks like maybe they just haven't submitted, and I don't really have an answer why, because we've reviewed that a couple times.
Do they have some people in for this year?
Yep,
So some of their members are up to date,
yep,
just not.
more than half. Probably closer to 3/4 of them.
When was the last time there was any contact with them about this?
I don't know, Karen talked to him mostly, so probably a couple weeks ago,
Yeah, at least 2 or 3 weeks ago.
shortly after they received the certified mail.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'm sort of at a loss for how else to get attention to this. I'm not excited about taking the LS agency offline, but especially if they're making some amount of progress.
Who's the medical director?
Why would they be
Dr.
offline
Lynch.
if they have some providers?
Right.
We only take it off if you have no providers.
Okay.
So, I mean,
Because they didn't submit anything at all.
oh, I thought you,
They've
They
entered
trickled
it,
in
but
after.
they've never submitted it.
Oh.
They've entered stuff, but they haven't submitted it.
oh, I'm sorry.
So incompletely entered, none submitted.
Yeah.
So just so I understand, is there any provider in that agency who's completed everything
Yes,
and is up to date?
yes.
Okay.
And they don't need you offline, correct?
that would be
I
my
would be
contention.
loath to do that, yeah.
Can we send a letter from the medical director to these individuals?
So I think it's kind of important to understand the process in terms of how these skills were entered. So you enter things into the portal, and then you actually have to submit your list once it's validated at the end. So that would be, if we thought of it in the paper sense, it would be them sending you these 5 people, and then sending you 8 more after that, and then 6 more after that, which they could do. They could hit submit multiple times. They've just never done it. Now, I'm actually kind of pleased with what I'm seeing in here, because this is light years ahead of where it was a month ago when they received the certified mail. So it might just be a simple technicality, and we could probably resolve this with a conversation with them in follow-up, but we just need to have an action plan if they're not submitting what they need to have.
So, I mean, I think that's part of the bigger discussion for all that stuff. So why don't we, if you guys don't mind, why don't we close out the UMD EMS report for
Yep,
everyone,
we'll come back
and
to it.
we'll put all that stuff together, probably the best way to tackle it. And have our review stuff like that. Do you have more? Scott?
No, that's it.
Okay. Let's circle back to Nurse Advisory Committee.
For nurse advisory, well, CHS had, yes, there's gonna be push for more representation from the Catholic health system. For nurse advisory, there is a trial going on through MERS for pre-hospital report, but I don't have any feedback on it, because it comes to the hospitals. It was Mercy Hospital and ECMC. The way the report comes into us, we don't know how it got there. So from our end, everything else is just moving along, so I don't know if any feedback or if it's even being utilized at any point in time. Want to thank that the phone numbers off the app were updated. I seen off the last one, so that was actually a lot of positive feedback because the crews are using it. It's very handy, obviously. So our feedback, there was a lot of positive that it was working, and be interested to see what the results of the survey was. That'll be the next thing to see on for feedback. Question that it came through, pardon me?
They're very telling.
The question that came back from the Erie County Opiate Task Force was actually brought and wanted to see if there's a tool called OD mapping that's used for fire and EMS personnel. If there was any interest in either the agencies themselves and or like a dispatching agency, so not everybody would need to access and do that. They would be willing to set people up also if there was any interest in that.
They're asking for data, or what are they asking for?
Well, what it is so if you
For addresses of OD sites?
for address to OT sites, it's through high incident trafficking areas, drug trafficking areas, so they can start. I mean, so you're familiar with it. I don't know if anybody else is necessarily using it. So they were asking to see if there was if more providers wanted to get logged in or on board with that.
Who does the data go to?
And
This,
does it open up the door for a HIPAA violation with addresses?
No, because it doesn't ask for patient
Who's
information,
HIDT?
Other than address?
other than
High
address.
intensity drug.
But dispatch addresses.
Areas, yeah.
It actually locks in your location from
Is
the
that a
phone.
federal agency, or is it a not-for-profit, or what is it?
it's federal, I think.
I believe it's a federal source or something that's associated with
Yeah, I think it's associated with the DEA.
Yes, I believe so.
We just got information on it, I think, Monday.
Last Wednesday. The High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area Program. Whitehouse.gov.
But apparently, if you put it on your phone, it's an app that you
It says it's
have when you click the button, and then it gets your GPS code, and then it says there was an incident at that location.
And it says it's supposed to allow resources to be available in that specific area.
Could you guys send us some more stuff about it?
Yeah.
This first week?
Yeah, I can't. Well, that's what it was. It was on Monday, and that's what
Totally.
Dan said, discussing this might be an opportunity to
Yeah, I think it's certainly interesting.
cover it out. Yeah, I mean, what they're using the track so they know that they have a bad batch of 1, 2, 3, 4 cases, and
It's literally live data. As soon as you enter it, it goes on their map right away. So it's,
They have more about it on the DEA website.
Great, thank you.
But I can get you, I'll send you Dan Ronaldo, who's the officer for New York and New Jersey.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Thank you very much.
And for us, that's essentially it then.
Thanks. Dr. Clemency, anything regarding the collaborative protocols?
We can talk about some of the cardiac arrest stuff at the end of new business. Why don't we get all the low-hanging fruit out of the way first?
Sounds good. Dr. Youngberg's not here. I'm not aware of anything from the QI committee. But that'll be just part of our leadership retreat. We'll talk about how best to utilize the QI committee and set up programs and what the REMAC would like them to do. So barring that, that brings us to old business. There's a couple items here. We've already talked about the leadership retreat, and I did that early. So it's forthcoming, as it has been for several meetings now. So the REMAC policy review. So this, some time ago, we asked to take a look at the policies that are on our website, update them, changes, things that should be deleted, and Beth Moses took the lead on that and got things going. And then since then, the regions have really picked up the torch and also done a lot of work to try to come to a consensus as to what policies can go away, what we should review and just kind of keep as is, but mark reviewed, that we're still behind it, and which ones we should change and discuss. And we've gotten through all of them. We don't have final recommendations on all of them. I don't know, do you happen, I don't have Wi-Fi here, do you happen to have that spreadsheet that we worked on, either of you?
I don't have it with me. I
Okay.
could get you on Wi-Fi.
Okay, that would be helpful. Do you mind?
No, that's fine.
Thanks. I'll bring over in a second. There's a couple that I actually asked Karen to send out yesterday that I think we can take some action on, or at least have discussions on. So they were emailed out yesterday. The policies themselves weren't attached. I just asked everyone to take a look at the website. There's 4 that were suggested that we could just mark as reviewed, and that didn't need any substantive changes. If there are changes that people feel are indicated based on their read, then we can talk about those now. But the first one of the ones were suggested we just mark reviewed is the blood draw policy. And this is the one that kind of responds to the Bureau's position on EMS providers drawing blood samples at the request of a police officer for DWI purposes. The REMAC policy says that our providers will not be complying with those requests, politely. I don't feel that needs to be changed. I think we should probably just mark it as something that we reviewed and still feel is the position of the REMAC, but I'm happy to open it up to anybody who has different comments. Okay. So barring any discussion, you can try to do these in mass. If there's ones that require discussion, we'll do that. The second one is the policy on interim medical directors, in terms of what happens if a service loses a medical director unexpectedly or on short notice, that the REMAC chairman fills in that role for a period of, I think it's 60 days, while the agency finds a new one. And that this also temporarily exempts the REMAC chair from the 10 agency maximum. I don't think that needs any changes. I don't think we've actually had to do that anytime recently. Any discussions?
Would you want to add something in there, or as assigned by REMAC chair, or is that not a big deal? In the event that your plate is becoming fuller and fuller, would there be a reason to do that?
We're the only REMAC I could find that even has a clause for that. And I was afraid to say something because I didn't want you to take it away. Because we have had to use it before.
Okay.
Maybe just to get it off the chairman's plate as quickly as possible.
And we do try. We do try to do that.
With all due haste.
I think it's probably fine. I mean, actually, there's an item coming up that we can talk about that might actually address that as well. Medical direction requirements, kind of criteria for medical directors and to give medical direction to our providers. Nothing's changed in the political climate or the legislative climate regarding this, so I don't know that this requires any changes either. And then finally, the explication regarding the use of kind of Viagra and Levitra and Cialis in the setting of chest pain before we give nitrates, to kind of talk about when those are contraindicated. There's no really discussion of that in the collaborative protocols, and that's another reason I think it's reasonable to keep this in place. So is there any discussion on those 4 items? Otherwise, we can just try to vote to do those.
So we're just voting to not change them.
Correct, voting to mark them as reviewed,
Okay.
unchanged.
Got it, yep.
Okay, so then I'll entertain a motion to mark those 4 policies: blood draw policy, interim medical director, medical direction requirements, and Viagra nitrates. Maybe we could come up with a little more clear name for that one, as reviewed without changes.
Motion.
Second.
Thank you. All in favor? Aye. Opposed?
Aye.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, phone people. Opposition? And it carries. There are 5 policies that were, after review by, the 2 regions and myself, that probably don't need to be around any longer. Cardiac monitoring policy procedure 2, even though we don't have a 1 on there anymore. Ambulance destination, diazepam controlled substance availability, diversion policy, and pediatric automated defibrillation. I think, in terms of like controlled substances, this has been addressed now at the ALS level with requirements for CS licenses and things of that nature. The diversion policy is also not something that's really we have to contend with anymore. PEDS automated defibrillation was a very specific policy talking about how many joules it can deliver. AEDs have advanced to the point now where this is no longer an issue, and I think it's substantively covered in BLS courses. And then cardiac monitoring policy 2. And ambulance destination, there's other policies that are still on the site that we're going to talk about as working in progress that address destination selection and things of that nature. So this policy is actually very short and doesn't give significant guidance to our providers, so I think it's safe for it to go. But if there's we can talk about any of these 5 now if anyone has any comments.
Just the ambulance destination one, is this the one that talks about Article 28 facilities or no?
Yes.
Because that is a, REMAC has designated that ambulances will only transport to Article 28 facilities, so are you looking to revise that to create an alternative destination opportunity?
No.
Or no?
No,
So
actually.
that is, it's just something that does come up and it has impacted things on occasion. I know other regions have, like a snowstorm policy or, emergency, where the chair can say, okay, we can transport to these designated facilities.
Mhm.
Of course, you're not gonna get paid for those under Medicare rules, et cetera, but, there may be some value to that is all I'm saying. There may not be,
I'm hoping to rescind this so I can divert ambulances to Dr. Clemency's house.
Gotcha, that sounds.
Totally the snowstorms.
Yeah, as long as the REMAC pays for it.
Or if it's just raining really hard.
Yeah, as long as the REMAC reimburses, I think that'll be helpful. No, I'm just joking.
For a little perspective from the rural areas.
Please.
I know Cuba is a hospital, it's a critical access hospital, it's an Article 28. But ambulances aren't routinely going there, and is that correct, Danny?
Never take any.
Yeah, and I gotta tell you, there is a time and a place for a patient to go to that hospital. When
Sure.
you're shitting kittens and you're got a critical patient,
Sure.
I can get it. So I don't want to do anything, pardon my French, I don't want to do anything that kind of would harm Cuba Hospital. I think it's one of those small hospitals that we are happy to have in rural America.
Yeah, I think if anything, this is a restrictive policy, not a permissive policy. So you're eliminating a restrictive policy, so I don't think it would adversely affect anybody.
Could allow it.
Yeah,
Right.
that's a good point, though.
I don't want to introduce confusion where there's some period of time where people will start bringing patients to urgent care centers and things of that nature.
Right.
I don't know that we're at risk of having a rash of that, but at the same time, since we're discussing a couple other policies that pertain to ambulance destination, maybe we could table this one, keep this one policy for now, and then decide at the next REMAC how we're going to reword the other ones into sort of one more cohesive policy to avoid it.
The other point I want to bring forward is as we discuss mobile and integrated health, destination is going to be a big thing.
So why don't we neither review nor eliminate this one?
Well, these are all for elimination, so why don't we remove that one from this list?
Yeah.
And let's look at the other 4. Yep. So we're looking at deleting cardiac monitoring policy procedure 2,
Which is really like how to buy a monitor.
Yeah.
It's exactly how to buy one.
Like,
Just talk to the salesman.
I wonder how good policy procedure 1 was. But. And then diazepam controlled substances, diversion, and PEDS automated defibrillation. Any discussion or on those before we move forward? We have removed ambulance destination from this action so far. Okay, so is there a motion to delete from the REMAC policies cardiac monitoring policy procedure 2, diazepam controlled substances, diversion, and pediatric automated defibrillation?
So moved.
second.
All in favor? Aye. Opposed?
Aye.
Excellent. Motion carries. All right. Yeah. All right. There were several policies that had been previously approved by the REMAC that had not made it to the website yet. In our discussions, we just agreed to post those as had been approved, and that's been done. Several policies that were on the REMAC website as having been rescinded, and all it was a PDF that said this policy has been rescinded. Those have just been deleted from the website. So I think it's getting close to being up to date. There's a couple more policies that require some discussion. If you guys can bear with me a little bit while I get my Wi-Fi set up, we can come back to that in just a second. Oh, you have? Excellent.
My only suggestion on the deleted policies is somehow indicate that it was deleted with the title. This way there's a history. Unfortunately, with these and having been in the system for quite some time now, you end up losing the kind of the institutional memory. So it would be helpful to have either an archive or indication that was deleted, similar to how the state has their website, just so that if there's research that needs to go back into something and why something was put into place, why it was deleted, our successors 10 years from now are able to do that.
I think that's very reasonable.
Most of them have his name on them.
That explains a lot.
NASP has a list of retired policies.
I think it would be nice to, if we could create a section at the bottom of the website, or at the bottom of that page. That would be fine too. Whatever is easiest and looks clean. And we could even put the dates that they were rescinded.
Do we want to put like the PDF of them being rescinded, or just like a list of what they were called and that they were rescinded?
If we're going to the trouble of making an archive, then let's make it an archive. I think. So that way we can.
Yeah, this way you have the policies there, so someone can research them.
The rescind date's important too.
The rescind, yeah.
Yes.
The effective dates. Okay. So I will. Let me just give me one moment, and I'll just jump on here and see if I can pull up the spreadsheet I was using.
While he's pulling that up, the people on the phone, can you let me know, are you able to hear each individual talking?
Not everyone.
Okay.
Can you hear me talking?
Yeah.
That's what counts.
Yeah. What did you say, Dr. O'Brien? All right, just being a wise ass. Oh, this is being recorded. Never mind.
You created a new policy about cursing on the phone? All right, let's see.
That definitely wasn't cursing.
Preaching to the choir, sir. Okay. Let's see, an update here. All right, so I've got my spreadsheet now, like a grown-up. Okay. So other policies, and we don't necessarily have to take action on these today since they weren't sent out for review beforehand, but if we feel ready to do so, we can certainly do that. So these are actually listed in order that they appear on the policies page on the REMAC website. So there was actually a duplicate. There was a 12-lead ECG policy and then like a 12-lead by a BLS acquisition of 12-lead policy. It was the same policy. Now only one is listed, and it's actually not listed in a policy. It's just sort of the write-up that was done when I was a fellow, and this had just come out to give some guidance. We could choose to codify that as a policy, we could just refer to the state's position, I think it's 1601, that talks about acquiring and whatnot. I know we tweaked sort of the guidance on this, but what had to be transmitted last time at the September meeting. Do you remember that, Dr. Clemens?
Yeah, we just tried to make it more general, so
Like they may transmit it, or?
to do every single thing. And
Right.
when I look at the minutes, it's kind of vague too, because it talks about compliant with policy. I think probably our best answer is for us to retool this policy more explicitly. I think that would probably be most helpful.
So then, why don't we refer this back to sort of this policy working group that we got?
Yeah, or if I just accidentally volunteered for it, I'll do it too.
You just did.
That's fine.
You will be part of that group then.
That's fair.
So we'll revisit this at the January meeting.
Yeah.
The second one is the ALS required equipment policy. This kind of overlaps with a couple other policies as well. There's equipment and medication list, and there's fluid medication minimum stocking requirements. These three really need to be, we're going to talk these over a little more and try to condense them into one that we'll propose in January. Ambulance destination we covered. Ambulance transportation is also kind of somewhat redundant with ambulance destination. We're going to work on those for next time. We've reviewed blood draw policy. Let's see. We voted on diazepam controlled substances and diversion. Equipment medication we're talking about already. Fluid and medication we're going to talk about offline. Let's see. Interim medical director we talked about. IV access policy. Let's see. This still requires a little bit of offline tweaking. It's more going to be just kind of a bring up to date policy from the discussion we had. There's still a reference in there to intermediates, but it's kind of more that like the intermediate level of care and not an EMT intermediate particularly. Just sneeze or a comment. Med direction application policy was a small edit that we'll present next time. Mutual aid policy. So the state has a position statement on this. It's 1206. I don't know that we need necessarily a separate policy. I think they overlap fairly continuously. Were you going to say something?
No.
Oh, okay. That's allowed. So we'll probably come back in January and propose removing this. We'll talk about it offline again. On-scene physician policy in terms of who can provide on-scene medical direction and assume care of a pre-hospital patient. We had some discussion about it does mention nurse practitioners and physician assistants. Nurse practitioners really aren't an issue in that they have an independent license. Physician assistants, the concern was how does this impact the commitments of the collaborating physicians. I sort of feel like that's I don't know that the REMAC needs to take a stand on that. I feel as though that's probably an issue between the physician assistant and their collaborating physician in terms of whether or not this is something that physician wants to be responsible for.
There was a draft rewritten of that policy.
I'm sorry?
That one was redone.
Okay.
And it was supposed to be presented for vote, but must have gotten lost in the shuffle. That one, nerve agent, med control, there were a few of them. There were like 4 of them that were supposed to be done actually last meeting that didn't get done. Should have been carried to this meeting that
Okay.
aren't buried there. So
I don't see.
them.
I don't know if the new.
It's not on your spreadsheet, it's on a former spreadsheet.
Yeah, I have on-scene physician here, but I don't think I have that policy itself. We can look for that in a minute and see if we can find it, because my note here is we'll discuss it November meeting if not passed already. So if we're ready to vote on it, we can vote on it, but we'll have to find it first. Let's see. Patient care restriction policy. This was a matter of, taking. Bizarre interruption. Thanks for the cookie offer. You're a distraction.
Yes.
So the patient care restriction policy, the question that came up in terms of limiting a provider's level of care within the REMAC and the notifications that has to happen. Somebody very astutely pointed out that nowhere in that policy does it say who should actually notify the provider that their level of care has been restricted. So it seems like everybody in the region would find out, except perhaps the provider. It seems as though that should really fall on the medical director restricting the level of care. So we'll codify that in the actual written policy and vote on it. I don't think there were any other changes that were discussed. So we could probably vote on that today, just to add that one little blurb: the medical director of the service will notify the provider of their restriction and status.
Maybe we'll ensure. That
Yes.
way it could,
Yeah,
so
you
it
could
be-
delegate it, but
Yeah.
they need to follow up that it happened. I agree with that. Patient info reporting, we're gonna revise for, there's a position statement from the Bureau that gives some guidance here. Our policy right now says if you can't give report to a receiving ED within 30 minutes, that you can, and it's not an unstable patient, that you can leave them in an open bed with a copy of the PCR. I have some reservations about that, so we're going to discuss that a little bit further offline. There's a couple other, the nerve agent one is not on the spreadsheet. We'll have to do better with that. Pediatric CME courses, we're going to kind of talk about merging with pediatric assessment and skills, so we'll come up with a revised one for those policies next time. Pre-hospital, like RNPA, basically advanced standing certification for people wanting to get through paramedic. I think the plan is we're going to try to update this to either match the state's position, which is 1701, or we're just going to refer people to 1701. I don't know that we need a separate policy.
So that was something that originated in this region.
Okay.
That's why that policy exists.
Okay.
So we could probably just rescind it.
Okay. So we have sort of two things to just talk about. All right.
There was cutting edge stuff that was going on in 1990.
Psychiatric transportation, we're also going to kind of merge with our destination policies and things of that nature. I do think it's important that we have some of, at least the spirit of that one, and that, to emphasize that just because someone's on 941 doesn't mean you have to make a 45-minute drive if they need medical evaluation before that. So it just clarifies that you can stop at a non-CPEP hospital if there is a medical concern before you make a long drive, or any drive, if they're not the closest facility. Radio capabilities and radio reports, talking about kind of frequencies and things of that nature. I know we had discussions about wanting to interface with RTAC about that. I don't know, Beth, if that's something that you think we should talk about in that venue under maybe the new REMAC agenda item, or if there's going to be, I don't know what your thoughts are.
It's an area of concern, that's why we put the surveys out.
Sure.
And we'll have further direction, I think, from our communications subcommittee when we meet to discuss the results.
Okay, great. So then we'll table those until that meeting, and we'll go from there. Reciprocal agreement, that's old, excuse me. Refusal of evaluation, so that was passed actually in March with a new form and policy that's been put up on the website now. RSI, so on here is kind of, do we keep the regional credentialing requirements? There was some feeling that maybe we didn't need any more because the collaboratives have a nice section on RSI, but they also specifically state that this should be subject to sort of regional policies. I think it's reasonable to have one, and I didn't feel that any changes were indicated.
I think, Mike, it would be worth a discussion regarding the two credential providers.
Okay.
Especially out in more rural areas.
It's going to be tough to get two people there.
Yeah, and there's only so many people that may be credentialed. I think it may be worth a discussion at some point in time about that.
Okay. Did you want to do that now?
Flight team, it's not as big of a deal, because you have two providers that typically are credentialed. We may have, we have down in Chautauqua County, we're moving in the direction of identifying critical care, transport, paramedics. We now have ALS fly cars that are responding out into more rural areas. Sometimes they're by themselves. And there may be times when we need to, as medical directors, identify an individual or individuals who may be appropriate to credential as a sole provider for our side. And this policy is going to prohibit doing so.
That it would.
And the whole conversation about RSI is a little different story, but I think as a medical director down in Chautauqua County, Jamestown, I think that is an important part of that policy that I think should probably be removed.
Is that our policy or is that in a collaborative?
I don't see anything in it.
That's in our policy. The collaborative actually don't say you need to have
Okay.
2 providers at all. So that was a REMAC restriction. I think, I agree. I think I think that's a matter of the service medical director. They could certainly, if there's a service that wants to credential people in RSI but is only comfortable with 2 providers, that's something that the medical director could do. I'm not opposed to removing it, but I'd be interested to hear other input. Anybody else? Thoughts on removing the 2?
Mike?
Yes, sir.
It's Jason Morton.
Hi.
I think when the policy was reviewed at some point by Don Tretaz, he said with the advent of rescue airway devices that it would probably be appropriate to go to a 1 credentialed provider. I just recall seeing that sometime in the past year. I'm the director for Medina, and we have instituted the RSI protocol, and we've had a couple intubations, and that's been done with 1 provider. Sometimes there are 2 paramedics there, but again, in the really rural area, making it necessary for 2 credentialed providers would be very difficult.
I seem to remember, and I don't have it in front of me, but I seem to remember that it did not require 2 credentialed paramedics, but the other person could be an intermediate. Taking Don's comments into account regarding the rescue airways, which certainly were not very prevalent or as prevalent when the RSI was put into place. I think it's a skill that's difficult to do easily as a sole person without any kind of backup, meaning people that help you with the procedure. Doesn't necessarily need to be someone who can intubate, but other people who are familiar with the general process. Good poster in an EMSP many years ago looked at the RSI process as something like 200 and something steps. So it's a very complex process. I think I'd be open to altering that so that there is some other, that there is some education of the other people that would likely be helping that paramedic do the RSI, and then a single paramedic. I think that needs to be worked on a little bit more before prime time.
Don, do you want to weigh in?
Absolutely. When we reviewed it in 2009, we moved away from 2 credentialed paramedics because the flight services were flying nurse medic, and not necessarily, the nurses weren't necessarily paramedics. And again, with the advent of the additional advanced airways that we have now in comparison to what was then, the ability to certainly rescue that airway in the situation of a failed intubation and still be successful with that rescue airway device that we're seeing more prevalent as a first-line cardiac arrest device. I would encourage, based on all the discussion and the rural area access and the limitation of providers, that we look toward a single provider medical director approval.
I think it's gonna be very rare that you don't at least have a BLS provider taking care of the airway while the credentialed provider, paramedic, is pulling up meds, all that kind of stuff. I think any paramedic can pull up meds and direct the BLS provider on how to take care of the airway while things are getting set up. I find it very hard to believe unless it's a disaster situation that a single paramedic would be with that patient by themselves without at least a basic EMT with them.
I think, so I don't disagree with anything that's been said. I think a lot of what we've been doing today is like housekeeping, and I think this is more of like a paradigm change.
Yeah.
So I think it'd be appropriate to kind of push this off to next month, so that or next time there's some aging and people can think about it or weigh in one way or another on the pros and cons. I think it's an interesting discussion, but I think it rises above the level of housekeeping kind of stuff that we're doing right now.
Can I just chime in on a thought on this real quick?
Please.
So, as we're looking at these things, I think it's really important that we understand these policies are on the books. And so, you know, we mentioned ambulance destination and Article 28 facilities, and we know that there's ambulances that have transported patients to urgent or to immediate treatment centers, and now we're hearing of a service that, even though there's a policy that requires two credentialed providers, that is doing it with one. I think we have to do one of two things. We either have to make sure that our policies are in line with our operation, which is a part of what we're doing in this review, but the other part is that these are not, we follow them when we want to follow them and we don't follow them when we don't. It's, if we're going to have that approach, then we should simply not have the policy on the book, because from a doc's perspective, I mean, I don't know. I mean, liability is probably an overused term in EMS, but it would seem if you had a bad outcome, especially with intubation, the first thing you're going to do is grab that policy and throw it underneath your nose. So this is just encouraging us to remember that the existing policies are the policies until we either change them or rescind them, and that in the process of revising them, we have to make sure that what we're coming up with in terms of policies, maybe less is more. I mean, we're doing this to try to have a system, but we need to be careful about this and make sure that we don't, these aren't perceived as optional policies to follow.
I think that's fair. I think, you know, I agree that we should table this until January and give ourselves some time to discuss it. In the meantime, I think it would be wise that everyone just keep in mind, however you know, medical directors plan to administer this at their service, that it's still the position of the REMAC that two credentialed providers need to be on scene to perform RSI. You know, what occurs outside of this meeting occurs outside of this meeting, but all I can tell you is what the policy is, and I think it's important to emphasize that. All right.
I would like to ask too, I mean, because we're doing this process, we found that there were several policies that were very, very old. Like before we're not even about it, but a long time, very old. I would like if we, maybe each year or every 18 months, we can have it be the policy that we'll review all the policies and either put reviewed or make the changes or delete them, because there were, again, some that were extremely old. I know when I was at the hospital, we used to do it annually. We'd go through all the policies, they'd be reviewed, new date, or thrown away or changed. Because it was pretty shocking to me. You know, poor Beth, I felt her frustration, so we started looking at things and we were like, wow, this is pretty bad. And I don't want to be in the same spot in 5 years from now that we're, you know, having all these policies that should have been changed, or, you know, medicine changes, so.
Yeah, I think, you know, maybe every 12, even 24 months, and then you cycle it with the REMAC chair's term
That's
of
fine.
2 years. Might be reasonable.
Yeah, absolutely.
I agree that we should have some periodic, you know, as much as maybe I'm not a fan of creating a policy to govern policies.
Right.
But we could just make it our practice.
Right.
That
That's all I'm asking.
every time there's a REMAC chair change, or every 2 years, whichever comes sooner, that there's some procedure to just glance at these things.
Is it in the bylaw? I mean, there must be bylaws for this committee, right? So is it already in the bylaws?
It's not.
It's up for the guidelines, yeah.
Okay, we're almost done. Home stretch.
Dr. O'Brien, I'm sorry.
Yes, sir.
Just on that topic in relationship to the RSI, so when we did the revision for the protocols back in 14-15, we changed the wording in the MFI protocol.
Yes.
Which was contradictory to the policy, the REMAC policy at the time as well. And it stated for use only by paramedics credentialed by their medical director and with the assistance of a second MFI trained RN or ALS provider. So I guess there you had a contradiction of terms as well. So I
Yeah.
guess, as an agency, where do we follow today? Because that was approved at the REMAC level in 2000.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure how that like this one. The policy is kind of vague. It says a second credential provider. It doesn't really speak to if it's a nurse or anything like that.
Right.
Right, but it says credentialed. Where the change was MFI allowed for a second trained provider
Gotcha.
versus credentialed.
Got it.
Because there was discussion on can a nurse be credentialed? B, what about the use of a EMT/intermediate at the time?
Makes sense.
Yeah, I'm sensitive to that, certainly. I mean, unless we're prepared to change the wording of this policy today to buy us 2 more months of time, we're stuck with the word credentialed providers rather than training. You know, if a medical director wants to take some liberty with what credentialed means, that's up to them. I think for now we're stuck with the wording as is, and I don't know that it's really worth making a motion to amend a policy that we're potentially going to change dramatically and remove those words altogether in 2 months, unless someone feels differently. Okay, so we'll keep that for now. Let's see. Transfer policy, we're talking about merging with other ones, so we'll revisit that. The trauma transport policy in terms of pediatric trauma destinations was passed at the REMAC meeting some time ago and just needed to be formulated and posted. With that, has that been done? Is that part of the update, Alicia?
I don't know if I have that.
Nobody ever had
No
put
one,
it in
yeah,
writing.
that's
Okay,
the
so-
one that
Oh,
Beth
yeah,
couldn't
Beth-
find.
Beth-
That's right, okay.
Not that she couldn't find
No,
it, just that it
It was
disappeared.
done verbally on the floor, but nobody ever wrote it down and submitted it, I believe.
That sounds right.
So if someone could write it down, we will put it into
Trauma transport policy was a new one.
format.
So maybe I'll write something up and I'll circulate it to make sure it's what people remember discussing. And
watch the video since it was
right. And
Probably your best bet. because
and we
there
can
was
get
not a
exactly
lot
what the
of
wording is, because there was some specific wording in there. Viagra nitrates we covered. Interfacility transport protocols we're going to talk about in a little bit as a separate agenda item, and then that's where we are. So we have several that we'll talk about for next month. I'll
Did
get.
you mention the helicopter?
I did not.
That's just been a kind of, had a lot of conversation around that, so.
So, I reached out to Don when we were looking at this, and it was initially tabled some time ago because it wasn't consistent with the most current thinking. And Don shared with me that a lot of work went into the state's position on it, and I forget what policy number it is on the state website.
So it's 0505. There was a subcommittee of this committee that was asked to formulate back in 2015 with Dr. Lacombe, Dr. Walters, Dr. Falk, Dr. Tansky, Dr. Lynch, Ned Weaver, Kobe Brooks, myself, presented, and there was the new updated policy guideline was passed on June 17th of 2015, but it never made it to the website. So the proposed adjustment and formatting to the new policy is based off of the old policy that was on the website from 2009. So I sent quite a bit of stuff to Todd relative to what went into that, and then kind of the draft formatting to the new policy guidelines of what you guys are looking for.
And I forwarded that on to Alicia.
Yeah, I got it this morning.
And I don't think we need to be any more restrictive than what the state policy says, so I don't see any problem with mirroring the state's position.
No, we discussed it at length when we went through it last time. I don't think we need to discuss it anymore.
So do we need our own policy, or do we follow 505?
We have a policy. We just haven't put it on the website. It
Right.
sounds
The
like.
the policy that we passed in June of 15 was mildly different. It incorporated much of what 0505 was, but it was mildly different.
We had some local tweaks.
Yes.
Yeah.
So was it ever put in writing?
Yes.
It
Oh,
is in
yes.
writing.
Oh, yeah.
Just
Oh, yes.
the wrong
And that's the
version's
one
on
you
the
forwarded
website.
me.
So
Yes.
that was the one that wasn't formatted to our policy statement
Okay.
that I forwarded, and then I took the liberty to format it to the current policy template, so that it could be just, moved into that, just minus the watermark, if you will.
So if you could vote on that, then we can.
Yeah.
Well, we gotta see it.
You already voted on it.
No, it's in,
Oh,
it's
okay.
in, it's the policy, it should continue to be the policy.
Yeah.
Let's wait till we get online, and then in our next group of housekeeping approving things, let's reaffirm it. But we have to see it. It's been 2 years, I don't remember.
Okay.
Right,
it's the policy,
Right.
so there's
It's
no
just not-
operational
we
change.
never changed it.
Right.
So we'll get it, we'll just send it around, so and if it needs to be another item,
We'll
Yeah.
hold it to
perfect. If it needs to be another item next month, then we can raise it in new business.
Let's add it with everything else that we're reaffirming next month that we haven't gotten to yet.
Okey doke. So that gets us through, I believe, all of the policies, which was an amazing amount of work, so thank you to everybody that was a part of that. We'll also get nerve agent stuff for next meeting, and try to put these all behind us and say we have now 24 months of bliss. So there were two policies that we kind of felt were reviewable as we went through these. Advanced standing, and I can't remember what the other one was. Do you remember? Okay. So then we talked about just endorsing sort of the PA advanced the nurse PA advanced standing for paramedic training. Mark is reviewed. I think that's reasonable, and then we can be done with policies for today.
Mutual aid one.
Oh, the mutual aid one, yes, thank you. Let me get that one
So the advanced standing, just mark as review.
here. Yep.
Which one?
I thought we were
Where's
gonna
the
remove
advanced-
that.
Where's the advanced standing? What's it called?
Uh,
That's not under A.
It's RNPA.
RNPA.
Oh, that one, yeah.
Yeah, that one.
Okay.
So, we're marking as reviewed, or we're removing it?
I think we should just remove it, because it's consistent
The
with,
state policy.
we were the pilot project for all of the state. Then, once our pilot ended, we just never removed the policy, and it became state policy.
And then
Yeah.
there's 1701.
Right, that's right. We don't need it. So that's actually a vote to remove. Okay, anybody want to make a motion to remove the PA advanced standing, or RNPA advanced standing, and just to be consistent with the state's interpretation of those?
Sure. Motion.
Second, anybody?
Second.
All in favor? Aye.
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 Opposed? Excellent, so that will be stricken and moved to the archive site to be created. And I lied when I said we were done, inadvertently. Dr. Walters has a proposed taser barb removal policy statement. In the past, we've required like some type of non-specific training by a service medical director before people could be credentialed to remove these things when fired by police. Police officers are trained to pull them out. If you can shoot it, you can pull it out, which we discussed on the way here. Seems to make sense, except for bullets. So this policy, it was sent around. It is a reboot of the prior taser policy. It simply says that without any extra training, EMS personnel can remove these unless they are in sensitive areas which are designated as the eye, face, neck, breasts on females, or genitals. And there's a description of how to do it. At this point, it was kind of sent out late. I'd like to get this so everyone can see it. But let's add that to January's housekeeping for policies, and we'll send it out.
And we had for a while operationally, introduced policies and then always waited till the next meeting. I don't know if that was in the bylaws or if we just kind of done it, but it's probably an appropriate thing to do for new stuff.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. Okay. I'm just going to set that for a second. All right, let's see. So that concludes that. We're on to BLS training requirements. Did you want to give us an overview, Dr. Clemency?
Of our meeting?
Of our meeting in last month?
Sure. Okay, so there was and I would certainly encourage anyone who's at that meeting to correct me where I am misspeaking. So there was a meeting with representatives from the program agencies, the REMAC, and the State Health Department about a month ago. talking about different credentialing things, both in terms of trainings and in terms of what the reporting requirements would be to the REMAC and whatnot. I think that, so this is now my editorialization, this is where I'd like to hear from others. I think we've made really good progress with getting provider credentialing done and people putting stuff together, and I think this has been very good for the region. I think, and again, this is my 2 cents only, the 2 issues that we need to think about as going forward is, one, is I'm troubled by the way it's being operationalized different in different regions, and I think we should have a more consistent approach across the board. I don't know perfectly what that approach looks like, but it's troubling to me that it's kind of being done differently in different places. And 2, I think while some of the things that we're encouraging in terms of credentialing represent clearly a best practice, I think we need to be very careful to understand where the health department feels the limitations of our authority lies. And I think we need to be very careful if we're going beyond what those limitations would be, not just in terms of recommending, but I'm talking both carrot and stick. And I think if we are doing things that go beyond what our stick type authority is, then that potentially is problematic. Especially it may limit our ability to credibly be a stick in places where we can be a stick if we're trying to kind of go beyond that. And in particular, the discussion centered around BLS providers and BLS non-transport agencies in particular. And do we limit our ability to truly enforce our policies among ALS transport agencies, for instance, where we very clearly have authority and jurisdiction, and where the state, don't want to speak for them, but very clearly I think would accompany us on that journey,
Yes.
versus some of the BLS or BLS non-transport agencies where our authority to credential those providers is a little more murky. And should we go ahead and take a step, it's not clear that statutorily the health department would be able to follow us there. Is that a fair?
Yeah, that's a fair assessment, yeah.
Okay, so here's your computer back, thank you. Okay. So, I mean, I guess, you know, this kind of opens the question as to, you know, how far does the REMAC want to go, knowing that there's, you know, probably a very real limitation to how we can respond to non-compliance, which is obviously something we deal with in a number of our venues. Scott, did you have any thoughts you wanted to throw out while we're talking about this?
I think one of the issues too to start with is, you know, we've talked about agencies being offline or online, and I don't know if that's probably the right way for us to think about this. I think we probably need to think about this on the provider level.
Yep.
Like, should a ALS agency have no providers, then they functionally would not be able to do what they need to do. But I think it's problematic to administer it on an agency level, especially among agencies where some of the providers may have been maybe compliant and others may not. You know, to me, if I'm starting to eke out where our authority is most clear, and again, where I think, not to speak for them, the state would follow us the most clearly, I think we're talking about ALS providers on the individual level. And I think we have the absolute authority to not have ALS providers practice ALS skills in the region who are not fulfilling the different requirements. I think that's completely clear.
Yep.
I think it's more vague to say, like, and probably not good policy to do something with an agency where some of their providers are credentialed and some are not, and I mean, that's an individual provider problem. I guess, is there a kind of universal agreement, at least of that piece of the thing? Or do anyone have, and then we can talk about BLS and non-transport, which gets unclear.
I mean, I think that's the way we do it right now.
It's on an individual basis.
It's on an
Right.
individual basis.
Well, I think that's how we've operationalized it. I think we sometimes talk about it in terms of agencies, and even at this meeting, the discussion about an agency being offline came up. And I think we just need to be careful with the way we talk about it in kind of our direction, I think operationally it's about what we've been doing.
Yeah, that's, okay, I mean, I guess there's a little bit more to it than that, but,
Okay.
you know, I think the sense is that that's really the way that we do it. You know, so just kind of keep in mind, I guess I want to be careful about how I say this, but this is reality. You know, there's a certain amount of, if you have 30 providers in your agency and 10 of them comply with the regional requirement, there's still 20 that, until somebody is telling them these people are offline or whatever, they're still going to continue to do whatever they're doing. You know, I think that's where our portal sort of closes that loop, which is where this whole having to hit the submit button comes into play, because then the medical directors also get notified of the people who are offline. And so it creates a different, I guess, a different level of transparency with that. So, you know, I guess in the East Amherst case, are they going to be a factor after today? More than likely not, because they just have to submit their roster, and it's just that click. But the reason why we do it that way is because services have until June 30th to submit their roster for their agency. The problem is that we're now into this window of the next year, because we're in the next certification cycle. And so we don't have them submit their stuff until everything is complete, so that we're not, everybody, when I say we're, medical directors, the program agencies, the contacts and the services aren't getting inundated with all of these bits and pieces of information. You know, you send an application to New York State that doesn't have all the pieces in it, it gets returned to you because it's missing elements. And so to go back to your original point, we do look at this on an agency by agency basis, or provider to provider basis. So if I have 10 providers, 8 of them have met the requirements, those 8 are online, or only 1 out of 10. That agency's online with that one, because of that one provider. So they're never really an agency that's offline unless they've never submitted or they have 0 providers that meet the requirements. And I think that's operationalized the same way in all 3 regions.
And again, we do it a little bit different. We actually send a letter to the agency with the person's name, their EMT number, their level. These are the people that can provide care. If your name's not on there, you're not credentialed. So it's very clear, because one of the things we had an issue was, oh, I thought I was credentialed. Well, if your name's not on that list, you're not authorized to provide care, and that comes from the medical director. We work with the medical director. We send it to them, they, you know, under their guise. And we find that works very well, because Dan gets a letter that says, well, 6 people aren't on this list. Well, he knows which 6 people to go after if he wants them to be on his rig. And if he puts one of those 6 people on his rig, he knows who's credentialed and who's not.
And so our agencies, when they hit that submit button, it's no different than them putting the stamp on the envelope and throwing it in the mailbox. That's what they didn't do. Even though we can see on the back end that they have 3/4 of their providers who are online, they haven't submitted it.
And if they didn't submit it to us, they wouldn't get approved.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just something that's kind of interesting. We're talking about credentialing and, you know, ALS privileges, but I don't know if everybody in the room is aware, but there is an ALSFR agency from Nassau County that the REMSCO suspended their ALS privileges, and they've appealed that.
Yeah.
The appeals to a REMAC come up to the CMAC, and that's something that's going to be handled at their level. But I don't know if it was everybody was offline, if they had a few people, and they just took the whole agency. It was the REMAC that did it, by the sounds of it, and not the individual agency's medical director. Now, and perhaps that major knows a little more insight on that, but it might be interesting to see how this plays out, and because you're talking about the extent of your powers as a REMAC, and we'll see what happens.
That was an offline discussion that I had with some of our docs, was that the 78 was going on, and that this will be very telling to see exactly how far it can get pushed. Which I think I think this even creates this whole BLS issue. It makes it even more susceptible to having this conversation, because if if the authority over BLS providers is marginal at best, there probably is a clearer authority over the ALS providers. And like you say, you'd hate to diminish something that really does serve the greater good, because we're trying to regulate, which a lot of those skills at the BLS level are community programs. So somebody who takes a CPR course that has an AED component can use the AED just the same as an EMT, but the EMT is regulated because they're certified. Now you could make the argument that that's absolutely necessary, and they should be, because you need to assure that an EMT really knows what the heck that they're doing. But I think some of these things we probably have to take a step back and say, we just are probably swinging our foot a little too far over the line.
Right, I think my recollection is the concern centered around exactly that, is, what happens if, an agency, or more likely a group of providers within an agency, don't meet the credentialing requirements, but either go through some other, like for, like public access for naloxone and things like that, that they can do anyway, and we don't really have this clear authority, and even if we say you have to do it or else, and we get called on or else what, and we don't really have anything. So it does kind of beg the question, is it
Yeah, it's always been my sense that we will have a hand in creating a public health crisis if we're shutting down agencies for a few bad apples within the agency. I think we need to focus on the individual. And that's where the squad medical directors need to step up and start writing these letters saying, you are offline.
So I completely agree. I think this is for the BLS agency, it's an agency medical director. So the question is, just to be very explicit, is should we be in the business of mandating BLS provider skills, especially for things that have become part of the community access model?
Or is that just a
should we leave it to the
responsibility of the service medical director?
Should,
And the REMAC, does have some authority over, in that we credential the service medical directors. So that is an extreme option that I would be loath to employ, but it is something that exists. And my recollection from our discussion is that was sort of also felt to be true at the state level.
I'll go ahead.
And I know I'm gonna be a broken record, but I think we've seen tremendous skill level increases since we have been putting in place the mandatory BLS skill requirements. It gives us, I think when you call 911, you expect a higher level of care than, Joe Schmo off the street that took the AED class and was in a naloxone class. I mean, we definitely, I would have a higher expectation if I dialed 911 versus someone on the street. It gives us the opportunity to network and, be with the provider and make sure those skills, and we've talked about even adding additional skills such as tourniquets and those types of things, but I personally think we would be stepping back if we took away skill requirements on BLS providers.
I mean, I think, all or none is certainly, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
I guess I'm a little confused, or, in one aspect, 20 minutes ago, we talked about a BLS provider helping RSI. In the field, we're gonna have a BLS person that's trained or can help out a paramedic in the rural area to do single provider RSI, and 20 minutes later, we're saying, I don't think we should worry about what BLS providers do. Maybe we should or shouldn't credential them. I think that the skills necessarily of an EMT may be very simple, using an AED. It may be very simple, but if you're in a rural area, and it's you, your cardiac monitor, and the patient in cardiac arrest, I'd surely like to know that once a year, you really know how to put that thing to work.
So I think we need to focus on the difference between what we should do and what we can do, though. And I think that's what our challenge is. So, so I'll use the example of Hamburg. So I'm the service agency medical director for the Hamburg Fire Companies. I believe in BLS skill demonstrations, but I think I, as their medical director, have very clear authority to mandate that among my providers. I think Mike, as the chairman of the REMAC, has more questionable authority to mandate that over my providers. And so if tomorrow this is limited in some way, the hamburger companies will continue to do this every single year. But I think we just need to be very careful what the extent of the authority is. The other thing that came up in discussion was the idea about, okay, what's the implication? How do we make this work, right? And so one of the possible options is to say that, you know, we have REMAC credentialing for basic providers, and you do all the skill demonstration and whatnot, but then figuring out the or what piece, right? And maybe the or what is you are still able to provide BLS care, but not able to do the, we'll call them the special things, right? Where we clearly do have authority. Like, so we have authority over blood glucose monitoring, and we have authority over nebulized albuterol, I think.
Yes.
You know, those kinds of things, right?
CPAP.
CPAP, great example.
BLS 12.
Right? Yep. BLS 12, those kinds of things. And maybe that's how we get ourselves in a place where we're still pushing things along in the right direction, but we're very clearly within the bounds of our statutory authority. And so if you're a BLS agency and you want to have your defibrillator and EpiPen and nasal naloxone and never go beyond that, and your agency medical director is okay with it, then I don't know what our...
And to an extension, the community you're serving is okay.
Well, right, well, that's a whole other issue in all of this.
Yep.
Right? But I think, I don't know, I think that'd be my recommendation. To still do it, have the program agency still support it, have the medical directors, you know, see where they are, but the real question needs to be ourselves, what do we do if they don't do it? And I think that's where you need to be very clear, and we have for the last 4 years to continue to kick the can around on this issue.
Does the state have any kind of, let me rephrase, how many challenges have risen to the state level regarding REMAC's authority over BLS providers?
Statistically, I couldn't tell you that without doing an inquiry. I really, I don't. I mean, regionally, I don't think we've had many. I think the, you know, related to this, we also looked at what other regions were doing. I did summarize that information to them, and I think, you know, I think that from a policy perspective, you guys got to decide what you can do, what you want to do, and what, you know, is optimal for certainly the system. And whatever policy we do put in place, you know, I would agree that we have to ensure that it's enforceable and to you know, put our best foot forward with what are the opportunities. We, as the state, said that we'll support you as much as we can, you know, related to your policy. You know, but there's certain things that, you know, people think maybe in the public health law or that we do have authority over that we may or may not. And, you know, you know, every entity has a right to due process, and, you know, I mean, the medical directors, you know, really from an agency perspective, the medical director, you know, like, I'll give you an example of sort of a sideline situation is, you know, we've got a case where we know an individual paramedic has done something, you know, terrible. Well, it's gonna take me, you know, up to a year or a year and a half before we can get them through due process to get their card potentially either suspended, revoked, or a civil penalty on, where the medical director can say, you know, you're not working under my license, you know, immediately, you know. So we oftentimes, you know, utilize the medical director to assist in that. I think that that's where you know, the bulk of the, you know, the BLS skills requirements, you know, should be on that agency medical director. I think perhaps the REMAC, you know, needs to make a decision as to say either we're gonna stick with it or we're not, but then maybe have system recommendations for medical directors for BLS agencies or something to that effect, so there's a standard set of, you know, so it's not like, you know, you go to agency, I mean, you know, collaborative protocols have helped significantly. You can drive from Albany to Buffalo and you can get the same level of care, you know, in a sense, depending on the provider and what have you, and good quality is what we're all looking for. But I think, you know, having that system, you know, dynamic where here's the policy, this is what we you know, the expectations would be, or recommendations would be optimal. I think the other component is if you're going to stick to that policy, and, you know, we had recommended, you know, reaching out to the municipal lawyer and, you know, all those kind of things. It gets complicated. You guys also have scarce resources to oversee these programs as to who's You got program agencies and, you have big responsibility related to it, but, it's a complex thing. It's not as easy as cut dry. And then, realistically, we may put all this paperwork together if we were to go after one of these entities, and the only thing that we could potentially do is a warning letter to say that, you know what I mean?
Right.
So it's really not as much as you would think or you would expect, potentially, depending if they're a repeat offender and all those kinds of things, but it's not, it's quite muddy and it's not as clear as you would think sometimes, so. I don't know if I just confused you, but I tend to ramble a little bit, but I think that it's, it's important that whatever the policy is, that you try to adhere to it, and first of all, that it's enforceable, that you can actually enforce it and to have some teeth to it and have it supported, but you also got those limitations as to what your, level of authority is, like you say, so.
And I think you hit on the really important thing. I don't think the REMAC wants to get into a situation where we try to make an enforcement action that gets challenged and it turns out that we never had the authority to do this. We rely heavily on the service medical directors, even the ones that are a little less engaged, to try to do some of the work in the REMAC or on behalf of the REMAC. I think, a reasonable approach would be to enforce the things we can and be very wary of overreaching. I agree that it might, it is a little maybe suboptimal, will be maybe not the best word, but the word I'm going to roll with, to have a fairly long-standing BLS credentialing policy and how we've been doing it, and then to just one day stop doing that. I wonder if that would cause some concern among people.
So I think the middle of the road approach then, Mike, is to functionally not change what we do, but just to say the if what, right? And so locally, local REMAC credentialing for an ALS provider means you can do ALS skills. If you do not have local credentialing, then you cannot do ALS skills. From a BLS provider, I think it means you can't do the special BLS skills, for lack of a better word. And that in areas that are worried about being able to run their ambulances and whatnot, and public health emergencies and those kinds of things, that would eliminate that issue. And I think it puts us very firmly in a box to force the things. I don't think anyone's going to come here and say it's a public health emergency, I can't do glucose monitoring on my ambulance. And I think, I would hope, you know what I mean?
But if we take the agency offline, they certainly.
Or the provide, and each, and we be respectful of the fact that the medical director can still absolutely make that distinction. But we wouldn't be functionally changing the way the thing works. We would just be very clear as to what the consequences for non-compliance would be.
And in terms of taking agency offline, that actually, like at the BLS level, that specifically came up at the meeting at the BLS. And the words were, you can say all you want, but you can't stop them from responding to calls. And none of us, I think, are really looking to create that problem. So I think it is reasonable to kind of enforce what we clearly have authority over, and maybe not try to do things that could overstep the authority of the REMAC. Is there further thoughts?
Yeah, I think the other thing to look at too is that the service medical director can go above and beyond.
Absolutely.
Things listed here, because before this started, you had EMTs that didn't even have CPR cards, that didn't realize they even reported to a medical director. So I think having a service medical director be the person to say you're no longer functioning under medical direction. If you go out on the call, you and your department takes that liability completely on yourself because you're not protected here. I think I understand what the REMAC is saying. We're putting that stick down to a more localized level where it should be. And then if that medical director doesn't do their job the way that they should be, that's recommended by the REMAC, then that medical director takes on that liability. But certainly to do anything less is completely a step back.
Yeah.
Without a doubt.
And I think it strengthens, again, I think when we are wise about the extent of our authority, it strengthens our ability to enforce things that are within our authority.
Yes.
So I think it strengthens our position with ALS providers to consolidate and be where we want to be.
Other thoughts, anyone?
I just got one real quick, because we should think about the skills that are being required at the BLSO. We kind of talked with the regional council. What skills should we test or credential the BLSO at? Is AED appropriate? Because we test AEDs every 2 years in CPR class. You know, so look at the skills maybe that require BLS providers to credential in it.
Which is true, but some of them didn't have CPR cards. We had
No.
a lot that didn't have CPR cards.
Right,
They
but
said,
now
oh, I have a
required.
card. It was 10 years old.
But that's where I'm saying that the service medical director can go above and beyond.
Yep.
You need to do the recommended credential, BLS credentialing from the REMAC, plus we need to see a current, you know, and that can be tracked through the program agency, and maybe some other medical director doesn't want that, I guess that's on them.
So, I am totally in favor of credentialing, and as I've been saying right along, you know, that I chaired the committee that wrote this policy. And so I agree that we don't want to take a step, take a step backward, but we just have to have a very clear definition of what the extra things are and what's going to happen if somebody doesn't do it. You know, I think keep in mind, you know, a BLSFR service that has an AED could get a doc from AED Superstore to be their medical director.
Right.
And as long as they have a New York State license, it's good. They don't know what a REMAC is. They don't know any of this stuff. Now, at least in my region, that's not the case with any of these guys, but that opportunity is there. And the same thing, you know, when we think about naloxone, what's the other one that's probably in the community type? Yeah, so epi, syringe epi now. Or just
No, not
epi in
syringe,
general.
not syringe epi. EpiPen. Right, so this is another place where potentially, I think we have some teeth well within the regulatory authority of the REMAC to say, hey, if you don't want to do this, you're buying auto injectors, right? And so we're clearly in our lane.
But the difficulty with that is that we don't really know who the syringe guys are and who they are not. Because when this policy got revised, it took the regions right out of it, and they just submit something to the CO saying, here's our new medical director verification form, and that's it. The regions have no idea that it does not require a regional approval. I can't tell you who's doing syringe epi in my region anymore, because if we're not their medical director and I don't physically see the medical director verification form, it's going somewhere else. And there's nothing that closes the loop on that whole thing.
I thought it was still
Submit a medical director verification form. That's it.
Right, but they have to submit them to us.
Well, they don't. It goes to the health department.
If you're an agency,
Yep.
they added it to the medical director change form.
No, they did. But it doesn't mean it's coming to us.
Just go to CO?
Just go to the central office.
Well, I would think we could change that if we wanted to, because the line of the policy says, must have a program, blah, blah, blah. This is with regional policies and protocols.
But we have regional policies and protocols. Doesn't mean they have to tell us they're using them.
We could make that our regional policy and protocol.
That won't mean anything because the state policy doesn't make them do it. So if we want to change this, we need to get the state policy changed.
No, it does. The state policy says consistent with regional policies, which empowers us to create a regional policy.
So if we had a regional policies about this.
Right.
I guess add it to the list.
So then, right now, that leaves us with the things that they do require approval from us as a REMAC. It's BLS 12 lead, albuterol, blood glucometry, and CPAP. Is that right? And EPCR, but I don't know that anyone thinks that's punitive. You can't write EPCR. So I left that one out. But in the interest of thoroughness.
Sign up for that? And other skills where it's required by your medical
right.
Please leave that out in that thing.
Yeah. So we have four teeth, and if we wrote another policy, we could conceivably
4.5
add a fifth, right?
Yeah.
4.45 teeth.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, I guess the issue then is this something we want to act on now? If so, do we want to do it based on 4 teeth, or do we want to make it based on 5 teeth? Understanding full well that if we made a new policy, it's going to take time for us to catch up with the people that have already submitted their form to the CO, and it's going to create a lot of back-end work, I think. What are people's thoughts? I mean, I'm in favor of credentialing. I'm in favor of having reasonable and back-upable, for lack of a real word, repercussions. I'm also in favor of not getting the REMAC in trouble by doing things that we really don't have authority to do. That would just get overturned by the CMAC or someone else. So I'm kind of open to, if somebody wants to make a motion, or if there's further discussion, or somebody wants to suggest we table this and maybe create a little side group.
So I think the way to operationalize this, my recommendation would be to create a policy called, like, for lack of better, consequences for not being privileged. Where we'll call it something clever, right? Where we delineate what happens if you're not credentialed. But we leave alone the current provider privileging policy, because we still want everyone to do this.
Yep.
And medical directors can say, hey, look, here's what you gotta do.
But doesn't the current policy state if you don't meet the requirements, then you're offline?
But it doesn't talk about what that means.
It does, doesn't it have a date of July 30th?
There's four definitions. Well, okay, so, no, actually, I think it's covered in provider restriction.
Right, don't you have a...
It's not in the credentialing policy.
Right, but we do have a...
There's four criteria, there's offline, there's partial
It
restriction.
doesn't say who's taking it offline, it just says offline. So that would come from the service medical.
And related to this, I think from a program agency standpoint, so that we're not sitting here in September saying these are the 10 agencies that didn't submit anything. We should have something that we just follow every single year in the form of a policy and one letter that we're all sending out, whatever it is, but.
I guess where were we at last year? Or did we have this big issue last year? I mean, I'm not discounting the portal, but, I mean, was the issue still at hand last year before, when everybody was doing paper? Did we still have the issue that we've had since the portal came?
We have this issue every year.
Okay.
But and it gets better, it's getting better every year. And I will say, each year, the REMAC unfortunately kind of kicks the can down the street as to what to do with enforcement. And I think has not given very clear direction to the program agencies at times about how best to do it. Which puts the program agencies in a bad position.
I think, don't conflate the two issues of ALS privileges and BLS privileges. I think we're squarely talking about BLSers failing to feel obligated to demonstrate competency to their service medical directors. That's really what we're talking about. And that's really all we're asking them to do. Demonstrate you're competent in these set of skills.
Right, I just didn't know if it was a bigger lift with the portal, if when it was.
Well, it's definitely a big lift to get everybody onto it.
Right,
yeah.
So, I didn't know if before the portal days it was paper, that these conversations.
So the
weren't-
services that I reported on last month could have been a copy and paste from last year.
All right.
Except we would have no idea that some agencies have providers that are done and they haven't hit submit, because it would have been, we have no envelope from this agency at all, right?
I was just thinking it was like the EPCR thing, to be honest. There's people that just aren't gonna go to EPCR because it is the EPC. I didn't know if that was where we were.
Got it. All right, well, it sounds as though there's not an issue with ALS credentialing. I don't know that we need to mess with that. In terms of BLS, I think we should probably talk about, I think we should probably just either create or amend the privileging policy to include, BLS providers that, don't meet all of the credentialing requirements by the deadline every year, by what, June 30th? Okay. Will be taken offline, and this will, this means they cannot acquire and, transmit 12 leads, administer albuterol, check blood glucose, or apply CPAP. And, I guess I would leave it to the group as to whether or not we want to take the extra steps of making a policy to also include and do the back end work for syringe epi.
Can I just ask a question? And Scott, tell me, why the hell don't we just do it at the end? Till they have the 1 year to do it. You know what I'm saying? I know they still have a year, but why 6:30 and not 12:31? I mean, maybe it doesn't even make a difference.
So here was the rationale.
I couldn't remember why that was, and I'm sorry, Mac, but I just.
No, that's okay.
This is something that I would love a mulligan on, but I don't think I'd change it even if somebody gave one to me.
Yeah.
The reason why is because if we have a hard time getting 100% compliance by June 30th. Now
Right.
do it on December
12:30, yeah,
31st.
holidays, okay.
When you got an EMS officer that checked out 4 months ago
Right.
on top of the
I
holidays.
get you, I just was wondering.
It followed the
And it
academic
doesn't
calendar
change, it's still
versus
gonna be the same people.
the normal
so-
calendar, that's
And
why.
I think we did have it as August, and then we moved it back to
Well, that was the,
June, the first year.
yeah,
So that they
No,
had a
so
little
there
bit
was,
more
there's a
time.
reason for it, I just couldn't remember what it was.
yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
So,
So are we saying then in the provider privilege policy as it stands right now, so we have this chart that's on page 2 that lists all of the skills by each level, and we have a bunch of little stars next to a bunch of them that are if the agency's approved, which is a whole another set of problems. But, so instead of having an X saying that it's required for EpiPens, defibrillation, and naloxone, we're noting that differently as if mandated by your medical director?
No, the approach that I'm recommending is different from that. It's that you still, if you want to meet the standards of provider privilege, you still have to do all of it. But if you don't, here's what the implication is.
It doesn't change, that doesn't change their ability to challenge it, which is what this is all stemming from.
Well, they could challenge it, but the medical director still has clear authority to take that person offline.
Yeah, the REMAC can make you do an AED skills verification in order to use a CPAP.
Mm-hmm.
Even though they're not one-to-one, it's still...
No, I don't think we're talking about the community-based programs. We're not talking about, we're talking about EpiPens, we're
Right.
talking about AED and naloxone.
Right.
Those are really the only three. The
Right.
rest of them, the region, I think, has probably clear authority over that, because you have to have a medical director.
So I think they need to still be part of skills demonstration, but if you don't submit your skills demonstration, I mean, that's what we're talking. We're talking about what if they don't do it.
You're gonna lose REMAC approvals
Right.
for all your extra skills.
Right.
Regardless of your credential and that.
Right.
You're gonna lose anything extra REMAC
But-
gives you, you lose.
But I'm not, at least my recommendation is not to change the way we do provider privileges, just to really delineate what the consequences of non-compliance are.
Which would be more enforceable.
So we're going to, so our service that has several hundred EMTs in it that has admittedly not done these skills this year,
Mm-hmm.
has submitted nothing, we're going to send them a notice saying
You can't do CPAP, well, not
they
them.
can't do AED.
No, AED, naloxone, and EpiPen, they can do.
These are community-based programs,
These are-
you only are losing the special skills, that's your stick. Is that
No, I
take
get that,
away?
I get it, but how is that noted in our policy?
This is what we have to fix. Oh, well, no, it wouldn't be the policy, well, they're just not compliant with the policy, and so we're delineating what the consequence is. They're still not compliant with the policy.
So they'd no longer be an EMT under the medical.
They're not a
director.
REMAC credentialed
They would be
EMT.
a community person doing those.
I mean, their medical director's authority over them, but they're not REMAC credentialed for the year. And here's the
It'd be easy
implication.
enough to table it and put a little work into it, because
Yeah.
right now, we're talking about 4 skills.
Yep.
But if next week they come along with the BLS provider's gonna put in a temporary pacemaker. Other things are gonna come along. And I think you mu-
As long as the
one policy
federal
that
approach
says-
is safety.
One
Yes.
simple policy that says, if it's not in the BLS standard curriculum or community, it's extra, and if it's extra, you have to credentialize it, or the REMAC takes you off that. But, I mean, I think you can blanket for anything in the future too.
Yep.
I mean,
I think that's a very good, very sage, yeah.
So then, why don't we put a little work into this and polish it for next time? Dr. Clemency, would you mind sort of taking the lead on that, since you called us your twice today?
Essie will remind me to do it.
Thank you.
I'll write it down.
Thanks, Essie.
All right. We talked about leadership retreat, which brings us to new business. So the first item there, since the September meeting, and we had this issue with Wellsville Volunteer Ambulance, I said volunteer fire before, but Volunteer Ambulance Corps, wanting to re-up to paramedic after getting their CS license, they needed this provisional approval, which I provided, even though we have never actually had to do that before. It kind of raises the issue of, should the REMAC chair be able to conduct the business of the REMAC in between meetings? And we typically do pass a motion for this over the summer every year, You know, do we want to sort of formalize this as able to do so in between meetings and trusting the position of the REMAC chair that if it's something that really needs more discussion or input, that action will be withheld until the next REMAC. But, you know, it seems like something we should probably just be able to do going forward, and probably has happened in the past, whether it was written down or not. It just seems like a reasonable course of action.
I mean, I don't know about this instance, but I don't understand what the emergency is, though, of doing anyone's level of change.
It was
like if things are emergencies to get stuff done.
It wasn't an emergency. It's just in order for them to get their license, in order to fulfill the requirements of their level of care upgrade.
Right.
They needed approval from the REMAC. So rather than say, sure, we'll give you your provisional approval at the next meeting, and then you can submit your stuff, and then in January maybe we'll talk about letting you upgrade. It just seemed like a reasonable thing to do in between.
Go ahead.
Just a matter of consideration, and we dealt with this with two of the muni cons that we were involved in. There are definitely times when there requires some REMAC approval in a 11th hour situation or whatever the case may be, especially when you're going through a muni con process or something along those lines. Hopefully never anticipate to do that again, but there are certainly many other communities across Western New York.
And regarding the Wellsville issue, if anybody wants to take a look at the correspondence for that, we do have it here. We'll pass around if anybody wants to see it. It was a fairly benign series of emails.
But it was because they let their controlled substance lapse in order to get their controlled substance paperwork in.
Right.
They had to have the REMAC approval.
But I guess in Don's case, I think Don would make the argument that his situation was there were some exigent emergency circumstances associated with it. Right? I mean, that would be your position for those cases.
And I think there's plenty of things where we would say the next meeting is in 5 weeks and we can take it up then.
Right.
But I don't know that it's, and I'm certainly biased being the position I'm in, but I don't know that it's unreasonable to just permit the chair on a formal basis to act on urgent or emergent things in between meetings.
We already do this with some of the other things, as long as the service is in good standing with the other regional stuff, which the program agencies will comment on.
Right.
It's just so if somebody submits something for, I don't know, naloxone or something like that, they're approved and they go forward, and then it's just logged in the next.
But we explicitly made naloxone a notification issue, not a REMAC approval when we built it.
That might be a bad example, but there are other things that require REMAC approvals. That I think CPAP is one of them. Might be an example where we conditionally approve these services. They go forward. I mean, I'm just giving examples of what things we do.
Very often. I mean,
I
this
would hope
was,
so, too.
I think, and I don't want to speak for you, but I think it was someone accidentally didn't do something, and it caused the whole agency to be knocked offline because one person didn't put something in the mail.
Let's be clear. Our discussion here is not centered around Wellsville's narcotics.
Right,
license.
absolutely.
That's that issue.
Absolutely.
Yes.
That's my question is what's an emergency? Like, again, so Don uses an example. I think it's reasonable if the REMAC chairman says there's an emergency situation here, we need to act. I think that's different than one of convenience. And I guess just looking at the retrospective scope, I don't know, maybe there is something that is more than just convenience and created an emergency situation where we needed to do something differently. If we're thinking going forward. So retrospective happened, it's fine. I think but if we're gonna make a policy around it, I think we need to figure out what the constraints are, or otherwise,
I don't know that we need a
every time I want to do something, I just want to wait for the meeting. Where's that line that the chairman goes to versus, hey Mike, I want you to sign this for me because I just don't want to wait. I missed the deadline.
So I think there's a couple possible actions, right? We could make a policy and then wrestle with what constitutes an urgent issue, or we could just kind of leave it the way it's been, where in conjunction with the appropriate program agency and/or regional council, like things just get done, and we put it in the record and reports, or we could do nothing and just kind of pretend that this never happens.
Well, and I guess, I know you said it's not about Wellsville, but is that something we shouldn't have done? I mean,
I still don't know the situation,
so.
So then here, So, the email that was sent to me from Alicia, it said, Wellsville Volunteer Ambulance dropped down to AEMT was dropped due to non-compliance with Part 800 of controlled substances. They've applied for their CS, but have not received approval from the REMAC for a level of care upgrade. I've notified Wellsville that they must apply to the REMAC, but the state is saying in order for them to proceed, that the REMAC chair must provide them with a letter or email indicating that provisional authority has been granted. So they were this was like a catch-22. Like, you need approval to get the CS, but you need the CS to get approval.
So it's different then. So what we're talking about is actually different, right? What we're talking about is provisional approval.
Yeah.
Right, oh yeah. The approval they got was very clear for me, saying, I don't see a reason right now that this won't go through, but you don't get to upgrade, you don't get to do stuff.
So we've done that before. I don't think provisional approval is a big deal. But they're not actually approved. Like, so they can't do it. So today they're not allowed to do it.
Not for another
Right.
6 to 45 minutes.
Yeah,
Right. That's different though.
But, and it allows the application process to move forward with the state.
And that's totally different than a.
So for the record, the letter that was sent, the email that was sent, said, Wellsville Volunteer Ambulance Corps is an AEMT agency in good standing within the REMAC, the West REMAC. The agency is applying for a level of care upgrade to paramedic in order to obtain a Part 800 controlled substances license. It's my understanding that provisional approval of the level of care upgrade from the REMAC is required after conferring with the service medical director, who's Frank Edwards. I'm pleased to offer this provisional approval. Such approval is to facilitate the CS license only. To complete the full application for a level of care upgrade, providers may not function at the paramedic level until they receive final approval, which requires a vote of the full REMAC.
Right, so that's perfect. What you did is, I think in this situation is ideal.
So I don't want to be the fly in the ointment on this.
Okay.
But I'm not sure what we do in the summer is actually permissible anyway.
It's always got to be
Let's wait for the summer to talk about that.
Why does it fall on one guy?
Let's move on.
No, I understand.
I can stop you somewhere.
So,
There's always that one guy.
So unless somebody wants to make a motion for a policy, I think my suggestion to the group would be that we sort of just leave this up to the discretion of the chair, who will consult with the appropriate people and make a determination of whether this is emergent or not. And if it is emergent, then they can take action, and if it's not, then it can wait until the next
How many
meeting.
applications have you ever denied for the upgrade?
And even urgent stuff, we could email to the REMAC and say, let's talk about this now offline.
If it's
Complete dragged in on CON.
I guess I'm concerned, I guess my concern is not at all with the provisional, but Scott said, well, we do it with CPAC. We send it in and people start using it. Well, if we're not, what is the point of approving it if you're gonna send it, if you send an application tomorrow for CPAP, and for the next 7 weeks, use it, and when we come to the next REMAC meeting, for whatever reason, the application's denied, the agency's already been using the CPAP for 7 weeks.
Right. Why are they doing it?
That's fair.
Because the committee passed a motion saying that the program agencies could approve these based on their standing.
So then, I guess it then does beg the question, what's the point of a REMAC vote?
But this is my.
Did the policy eliminate the need for a vote? Or did it just say you can go ahead and start?
I'm completely unclear on it.
Yeah.
We just did it. But this is my point. A provisional approval by the REMAC was not a provisional approval by the REMAC chairman.
Yeah.
Which means the body votes to provisionally approve something. Again, this is not Wellsville. This is a CON issue. There are other things. And if something ever got challenged for this, I mean, I guess you're an extension of the state entity, you know, the state would defend it, but I think we should be asking for an opinion on this. But
And I mean, it's not just provisional. I mean, our example was a summer approval in the town of Niagara, filed for a municipal CON under what their interpretation was agreed upon was an emergency condition, and the REMAC chair was pressed to have to complete a letter of ALS approval for that agency to operate at the paramedic level.
I think that was not during the summer though.
Yes, it was.
Yeah,
It was?
Yeah, it was.
he was told
It was August 10th. I recall Dr. Walters and I's conversation.
Told by who?
Very
by
well.
the state.
It was a,
He was
State right
advised by the state it had to be done, correct?
well, I don't think we should go into a lot of detail at this point. I think there was a controversial situation between the REMAC chair and there may have been some differing opinions that probably shouldn't be discussed publicly. But I understand where you're coming from. Is that good enough politically to say, I mean?
I'm totally good with it politically,
Yeah.
I'm just raising it as an option,
I don't think we should
consideration based
discuss
on
it.
the conversation.
But if it's truly an emergency, then there
Let's
should
use
be
the
an
president,
emergency
let's stick
meeting.
with the emergency president in the meantime, though. We'll make it clear.
If it's truly an emergency,
So
then you
then-
have an emergency
I
meeting.
think that's reasonable. So for now, and we can talk about it some other day. For now, why don't we agree that if that happens, then there will be discussion of an emergency meeting, if it's really that big of a deal. Because if it's truly an emergency, then it probably demands the attention of the whole REMAC.
But the practice should be consistent.
Agreed.
So he's saying no more summer provisional.
Well, I'm just saying,
Right, I mean.
provisional anything.
Oh.
I don't really agree with it, but it's.
I mean, so that
there's
situation,
an appropriate process.
couldn't have applied for their.
Right, it would have delayed this
And then
process.
it would have delayed them from providing, paramedic care for 6 weeks.
I get it, and the same thing with the town of Alden EMS. There was a provisional approval for the town of Alden EMS. That was a MuniCon.
Yes.
Yeah, there's more of those coming.
Yeah.
Alright. Motion will lay on the table for next week, next month, or 2 months from now. Make it go
Standard
away.
REMAC policy. Okay.
Make it away.
But do we have to vote on the Wellsville issue to make that?
That's listed in here. That's in here. Okay, there was a request from Oshai to discuss kind of their new thing.
Yeah. Hi.
All right, hi.
How are you?
Welcome. Thanks for sitting through, the rest.
Hey, it was great. Kept me wide awake.
No worries. All right. I feel rested.
No, I wanted to be here because I know there's some confusion out in the community with the move. 5 days ago, we closed Children's Hospital on Bryant Street and opened up Oshai at 818 Ellicott Street. So I just wanted to be here to answer any questions if people have any. I think Beth and I were just talking, there's some confusion of the number to call when you're calling for medical direction or to transfer a patient. The proper number to call is the 323 2010 number. Wait, let me do it.
2110.
2110. Yeah, 2110. Yeah, sorry. Number.
That's a medical command?
Yes. 323-2110.
And pre-notification.
It also shows up in the agenda.
It's in the app.
Right. With the.
Do you know if we changed it right on the app?
We're getting there, we're getting there next.
Coming up.
We're getting there next.
General report.
We're getting there next.
It's
That's where
correct
the
now.
question.
Has it been updated?
Yes.
Excellent.
No, but have they pushed it through?
Yes.
As an update.
Yes.
I was told yes, but.
Yeah, I confirmed, yes.
Yeah, that was updated. on the
I will
app.
say this, that when it was pushed out, the vendor, or whoever you guys hired to do the app, transposed the number. It was on there for 24 hours as a wrong number, but they since corrected that.
Disappointed me.
We provided. No, I don't know who they hired. I don't know who the vendor is, but it's proper now from what Oshai had sent over to us.
So
it's updated now.
OCH, not W. Chapman.
Yep.
Yeah, it's in the app as appropriate, so.
All right.
And the map goes to 818, Ellicott Street, Brussels.
Excellent.
So,
Anything further?
Tim had sent over what he wanted in the app, so that's what we put on. If it's something different, we went with what he told us.
okay. So I'll make sure we get that cleared up. It's just this 858 number that's.
Yeah, there was a notice that was put out by Erie County EMS that some people got, some people didn't. It got pushed out through Hamburg's emergency management. That added another number that says ambulance pre-notification. Pre-arrival notification was to an 858 number, was added to the memo. So.
That's MERS.
That's MERS.
Well, who that?
So
I'm not going there, sorry.
they, MERS
Okay.
tried to do some other.
So
that's
we'll
not
talk
us.
about that. We'll talk about 858. Anything else from Oshai?
No, so as long as everybody knows, plus I also wanted to just say that Malachi Fisher is no longer with Children's. He's moved on to a bigger and better things. Jeff Abbott is taking his position, and so when you do call, if you need any type of assistance, Jeff Abbott would be the contact.
All right. Well, thank you for coming, and welcome, Jeff.
Oh, thank you, Michael.
That's all I get to say, though.
Wow, we are a rough group today.
You still owe me a cigar.
I do. Okay, there's also interfacility transport protocol review. So when we were talking about the policies, the interfacility transport protocols have been not updated in some time and are exceptionally weathered. I think the best way to deal with something, a document that's that important and weighty, is probably to resurrect the Interfacility Transport Protocol Committee that was previously chaired by Dr. Teuscher. I think that would be probably the best group of people to address this. I don't know if you're still on the phone, Dr. Teuscher, but I would certainly give you first right of refusal if you were interested in resuming that role.
I could do it with people on the committee.
Wonderful. We already got a volunteer from Dr. Clemency on the way here. We're just stacking it on now.
Yeah, that's my boy.
Karen, add it to my list, please. Thank you.
And I know there's already some people that have spoken to me about being interested in helping, so I will direct them to you if that's okay.
Wonderful.
Awesome. Cool. That was just as short as I was hoping it would be. Before we move on to approvals en masse, did you want to touch base with 858 MERS?
Okay, yeah, and then I think under the cloud protocol.
Sure.
Right. So 858 MERS has been set up. Currently, if you're in Erie County, you can call that number and speak to a dispatcher, and he will ask you what hospital you want, and they will connect you to that hospital. They're also recording that line. There is no official REMAC policy about this at this juncture. If you would like to use it, agencies are certainly permitted to use it. They should be aware that the phone call is being recorded, and it is one way to get hospitals if you don't have the app or you don't want to do it and you want something. The downside is there's another step along the way where you got to talk to one more person. The upside might be that you only need to find the phone number. So it is out there. It is an option for agencies in Erie County if they want to use it, but there is no official change in any of our policies relative to this.
And Greg Gill had to get off the phone, but he's planning on discussing a little bit more at the next meeting.
So any agency that is going to
To be clear, I don't believe they have in place forwarding to non-Erie County sites yet, as far as I know. But certainly anybody coming from another county is more than, and it might be a really good option for someone coming from somewhere where you don't have those phone numbers at the tip of your thing. To be like, I'm going to Erie County, let them sort it out for me. That might be a really good option. So I just wanted to speak briefly, given the hour, and get the body's sense of if this needs to be a policy, if this needs to just be something we do, or whatnot. When you look at CPR guidelines, the science is very murky, and there's lots of ways to do things in terms of high-performance CPR systems, and then they're distilled down into books that are golden tablets and say you must do it this way, right? But if you read the actual science, it is much more gray, and there are a lot of high-performance systems that are doing things differently. Things like minimally interrupted CPR with passive insufflation for the first 8 minutes, prolonged on-scene cardiac arrest management, things like that. And I think the REMAC should weigh in to support medical directors and agencies that are trying to build high-performance systems that are doing evidence-based things that are perhaps slightly different than the golden tablet says as part of a larger piece. And I'll give you a very specific example. I am looking at doing passive insufflation and minimally interrupted CPR in some of our agencies because I think that is probably the next step. And that only comes after a prolonged period of looking at monitor data from individual cardiac arrests and knowing exactly where we are lacking or where we can further even improve some of our CPR stuff. And so I think the REMAC should come out and just sort of say that there are multiple ways to skin this cat, and it is very reasonable to do other evidence-based approaches besides strictly 32 and whatnot, which has been codified. But you got to remember, the way the HA works is they have to pick one way to teach the masses, right? And it seems really, really clear when you're reading the little card that you put in your back pocket. But when you actually read the documents that they produce and then read their citations, it's clear there are lots of ways to skin this cat. And their decisions have to be as much about how to train the lay responder or how to train someone who's not working as part of a cohesive system as it is to be what the best science is. And so I don't know if we want to number one, we may not want to weigh into this at all, which I think is wrong. I think we should say something about this. We could try to create a policy statement about it. We could just affirm it. I drafted some language this morning while I was sleeping to consider.
That goes well.
So what I wrote is we passed around is high quality CPR is the cornerstone of cardiac arrest care. While standard protocols and guidelines typically describe a single algorithm for cardiac arrest care, there are multiple acceptable evidence-based approaches. EMS agencies and their medical directors are empowered to collaboratively design and customize evidence-based, high-performance CPR systems based on the need of their community, agency, and partners. This may include, but is not limited to, the following modifications: prolonged resuscitative efforts on scene by all levels of care, passive insufflation as a means of oxygenation, alternate ratios of ventilations to compressions, deferring advanced airway procedures, introducing process to limited hands-off time during defibrillation, preferentially transporting patients to PCI-capable centers, and performing high-energy and or double sequential defibrillation. I think all of these things are supported in the literature, and all of these things potentially represent slight tweaks from the golden tablets. I'm not suggesting that this should be done lightly by an agency, just do whatever they want. But I think if you have a system that is carefully examining what they're doing, like I'm trying to do with my agencies, and you've got a better mousetrap, I think you should be empowered to go after that better mousetrap.
That's currently what we're doing in Pennsylvania. We're dual state certified, 200 uninterrupted compressions, and you don't move or package the patient for the first 10 minutes.
Right. So, to me, I don't even think this needs to be a policy. I would be comfortable if the REMAC just voted on this and just said, we think this is reasonable. We're not asking for anything major, but I think this will then give cover and support to agencies that are trying to innovate within the confines of the science. So I would make a motion to just approve this as just something we have reviewed and is the position of the REMAC.
So,
I would.
this would be a notice?
I don't even think, I think we just put our minutes.
Yeah, I think a friendly amendment would be to
Yeah,
title
please.
it a additional CPR guidelines supported by the REMAC.
Sure, absolutely, accept it.
Is there a second to the motion?
I'd second
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed? Okay. Last order of business, unless there's anything else, would be approvals en masse as listed on the agenda. There is one addition to the level of care change that was sent in this morning. Hinsdale in the southern region has submitted a completed level of care upgrade from EMT to advanced EMT. And so that's the only addition to level of care. Otherwise, Wellsville, Brockton are also listed there. No other changes to PAD, notifications, glucometry, naloxone, epi, or CPAP. So those are as listed on the agenda. Entertain a motion to approve these as a group.
I'll make a motion.
Second.
Moved and seconded, all in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed? All right. Any other new business before the REMAC? Mr. Treepath.
No.
Oh, yeah, the other one.
Second, Mr. Treepath.
I said hurry up, Scott's out.
I promise I'll be brief based on the hour. I just wanted to present to the REMAC something I recently presented at our agency level for consideration, and I would appreciate if people would think about this, because I think that we need to take a stance from a regional standpoint to hopefully get the state to take a stance as well. So the short story is this. For a long, long time, I think we've all, I know that I've personally embraced it in my own practice, doing the play where they lay and leave them be if they do not resuscitate mentality, right? So AHA pushed that out 2 revisions ago and said, you know, play where they lay and leave them lay if they do not resuscitate. And I think we all do that, and it makes sense in a home setting, in a office setting, in any non-public setting. We recently had a situation in our organization where it happened in a public setting, and then we were also made aware that there had been one recently, even before that, where it had happened in a public setting, and the patient was left in not necessarily a controlled environment in the eyes of the public for hours, waiting for an ME's office to come in and take that patient away, because the patient had been declared on scene following a resuscitation. It wasn't an obvious death, it wasn't a traumatic shooting or anything along those lines. I think that we as a medical community need to look at some process or some ability or some guidance to our providers that if the patient is in cardiac arrest on Main Street in the middle of Olean, all right, and we play them where they lay and we don't put them in the back of an ambulance, and we decide that it is better to resuscitate them there and not transport them, and subsequently they're asystolic, and we call it, we don't leave them under a sheet in the middle of Main Street in Olean in front of the Beef and Barrel. Is that what it's called? Okay.
That's here, don't put it in.
We'll just bring them in.
Which roundabout?
I understand that this could be a 4-hour conversation, but I had said I was going to bring it here, and I wish that we would consider this as a thought process of how do we approach this as a medical community out of the hospital. I think there's arguments on all sides of the coin here, but either way, I think I know that I would not want my family member under a sheet on a baseball field in front of 200 people for 3 hours. Okay, that would be me.
I think you make a very valid point, and we actually have talked about making somewhat this a topic at our next conference, because we actually have the opposite issue. People are running codes and bringing people to the hospital that have been obviously passed away for a while, just because they don't want to deal with the family. So, I mean, I think coming up with some kind of education and some stance that's, kind of very clear, would be very helpful for us.
I agree. And it's, dealing with death and dying is not a focus at EMT education centers across New York State. So I think it's a larger issue than just your perspective.
I think the challenge is, in one sense of what Don's saying, I think the challenge is whenever we talk about this, when we try to grapple this with ourselves, the answer is, what do we do instead? Right? And that's always been our biggest challenge, right? I equally am concerned about the prospect of going lights and sirens down the street with the corpse, right? And so I at the core, I share many of Don's same concerns, but I still in my mind have not been able to come to acceptable or what. And I think that's what we all need to think about as we kind of go down this pathway, because I don't know what the right answer is to that piece, and I don't know how we justify the other stuff if we don't have a system to build it. Can we take them to the ME's office? Can we do something?
So I think, my suggestion would be what I believe Don's suggestion is, which is let's all take the next 2 months to digest this, think of it, explore kind of what options, what alternatives we may have, and then come back in January, prepared to maybe not even make a decision then, but at least have a heartier discussion about it. We didn't spend a long time talking about policies.
And we'll be happy to share. We are actually doing research right now, because like I said, we kind of the opposite issue, because all lights and sirens.
Yep.
And then the hospital gets very mad, and
yep.
So we're actually looking into it from the other side. So coming to you with some answers.
And I think from a public health standpoint, there are problems with transporting people who have been dead for an hour. There are problems with transporting somebody who has been, for a long time, and we worked them, and now they're dead now. But the one area where we need to be singularly focused on is that resuscitatable patient. And I think the science shows that if we scoop and run that guy who's still in a shockable rhythm, we are leaving survival on the table. And that's got to be the place that we are just completely focused on when we do quality improvement.
So we'll table that for next meeting to discuss a little bit more in depth.
If any of the docs are interested in, and are willing to be part of our group, because it is something we're trying to research on, or if you have somebody that might be a good resource for us, please share that, because again, I think this is new territory.
Okay. Any other new business? Okay, then we'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion.
That took longer than I thought.
Drive 2 hours back, though.
I worked last night. Just kidding.